June 17, 1944. Field Hospital, Saipan, Mariana Islands. Private First Class Takeshi Nakamura regained consciousness slowly, his mind struggling to process sensations that didn't make sense. He was lying on something soft, a bed, not dirt. His wounds were bandaged, and the pain, while still present, was muted. An IV tube ran into his arm, delivering clear fluid. Then he saw the medic standing over him. An American. White armband with a red cross. The enemy. Terror flooded through Nakamura. He tried to move, to reach for a weapon that wasn't there, to die fighting as he'd been taught. But his body wouldn't respond. Too weak from blood loss, from the chest wound that should have killed him. The American medic, a young man who couldn't have been older than 22, noticed Nakamura was awake. Instead of the violence Nakamura expected, the medic smiled gently and said something in English Nakamura didn't understand. Then the medic checked Nakamura's IV, adjusted his bandages, and gave him water. Nakamura's mind couldn't process this. For 3 years of military service, he had been taught absolute truths. Americans were beasts who tortured prisoners before killing them. Capture meant torture, mutilation, death. The only honorable choice was to fight to the death or commit suicide rather than surrender. Yet here he was, a prisoner, and the American was helping him. The medic's hands were gentle as they adjusted bandages. The water was cool and clean. The bed was more comfortable than anything Nakamura had slept on in 2 years of Pacific warfare. "Why?" Nakamura whispered in Japanese, knowing the American wouldn't understand. "Why are you saving me? Why haven't you killed me?" The medic, not understanding the words but recognizing the confusion and fear, simply patted Nakamura's shoulder reassuringly and moved to the next bed, where another wounded Japanese soldier was receiving the same professional medical care. What Nakamura didn't know, what he couldn't have known based on everything the Imperial Japanese Army had taught him, was that he was experiencing the collision between two completely incompatible military cultures. Japanese doctrine taught that enemies should be killed without mercy, that prisoners deserved deaths. That surrender was the ultimate disgrace warranting execution. American doctrine, rooted in Geneva Conventions and military medical ethics, taught the opposite. Wounded soldiers, regardless of nationality, deserved medical care. Enemy wounded were patients first, prisoners second. Military medics saved lives because that was their job, even when those lives belonged to enemy combatants who had been taught to kill them. Over the next weeks, Nakamura would witness American medics working exhausting shifts to save Japanese wounded, sharing limited blood supplies with enemy soldiers, performing complex surgeries on men who had been trying to kill Americans hours earlier. He would watch enemy medics show more concern for Japanese wounded than Japanese officers had shown. And like thousands of other Japanese POWs, he would experience a psychological transformation so profound it would define the rest of his life. The shattering realization that everything he had been taught about the enemy was a lie, and that the Americans he'd been trained to view as subhuman monsters possessed more humanity than his own military culture. This is the story of how Japanese soldiers were taught that capture meant death. How American military medical ethics saved enemy lives even when those enemies expected execution. How thousands of Japanese POWs experienced psychological trauma, not from American cruelty, but from American mercy. And how the collision between Japanese death before dishonor culture and American life-saving medical practice created one of World War II's most profound cultural confrontations. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered expecting death discovered instead that American medics would fight just as hard to save their lives as they fought to save American lives. This mercy, more than any battlefield defeat, would shatter their understanding of everything they had believed about honor, war, and humanity itself. To understand why Japanese POWs were stunned by American medical care, we must first understand what they had been taught about surrender, captivity, and the nature of their enemies. Japanese military indoctrination regarding surrender was absolute and uncompromising. The Senjinkun, Field Service Code, issued to all Japanese military personnel in January 1941, stated explicitly, Article 8, do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a name of disgrace. This wasn't metaphorical guidance, it was literal operational doctrine. Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, worse than death. A soldier who surrendered brought shame not just on himself, but on his family, his ancestors, and the emperor. The proper response to imminent capture was suicide, preferably by fighting until killed, alternatively by self-inflicted death. This doctrine was reinforced through every aspect of military training. Private Shigeru Matsumoto, who would later become a POW on Okinawa, described his training. From first day of basic training, we were taught that capture was unthinkable. Officers explained that honorable soldiers died in battle. Only cowards surrendered. We practiced banzai charges, attacking overwhelming enemy forces knowing we would die. This was presented as honorable. Surrender was presented as worse than any death. We were told stories about prisoners being tortured by Americans, mutilation, starvation, cruel experiments. The message was clear. If captured, you would experience hell before death. Better to die fighting than suffer torture as prisoner. Better to commit suicide than give the enemy the satisfaction of capturing you alive. By end of training, we believed absolutely death before capture. This wasn't just military doctrine, it was moral truth we internalized completely. The indoctrination regarding American treatment of prisoners was even more explicit and completely fabricated. Japanese military propaganda created a systematic narrative about American brutality. Japanese propaganda claims about American POW treatment. Americans routinely tortured prisoners before execution. American soldiers mutilated Japanese dead and wounded for trophies. American medics performed cruel medical experiments on prisoners. American forces killed prisoners to avoid the burden of guarding them. Americans showed no mercy to wounded enemies, executing them on the battlefield. These claims were reinforced through multiple channels. Training films showed dramatizations of American soldiers brutalizing prisoners. Newspapers published fabricated stories of American atrocities. Officers shared eyewitness accounts of American cruelty, accounts that were pure propaganda with no basis in reality. Lieutenant Tadashi Nakamura, captured on Saipan in June 1944, explained the psychological impact. We were shown films of American soldiers laughing while torturing prisoners. We were told Americans considered Japanese subhuman and would kill us like animals. We were read testimonies from soldiers who witnessed American atrocities before being killed, testimonies that logically couldn't exist since the witnesses were dead, but we didn't question this because we were taught to accept what officers told us. The most effective propaganda wasn't dramatic torture stories. It was the constant message that Americans were fundamentally different from us. We were told Americans lacked Japanese honor and Bushido spirit. Americans valued individual life over national duty. This made them weak but also cruel because they couldn't understand honorable behavior. Americans would torture prisoners trying to extract information because Americans couldn't comprehend dying for honor rather than talking to preserve life. By the time we deployed to combat zones, we absolutely believed capture by Americans meant torture and death. The only variables were how long torture would last and whether death would come quickly or slowly. This indoctrination was tested repeatedly in combat situations. Japanese wounded who couldn't retreat often committed suicide using grenades, knives, or pistols rather than risk capture. Japanese soldiers witnessed this behavior and understood it as proof of honorable conduct, dying by one's own hand rather than surrendering to the enemy. The few instances where Japanese soldiers were captured unconscious or too wounded to commit suicide reinforced propaganda narratives. When these soldiers were repatriated or escaped, they rarely contradicted propaganda about American treatment. Not because the propaganda was true, but because admitting they hadn't been tortured meant admitting they had surrendered, which was itself deeply shameful. The result was a self-reinforcing propaganda cycle. Japanese soldiers believed Americans tortured prisoners, therefore they fought to the death or committed suicide rather than surrender. Therefore, very few Japanese soldiers experienced American POW treatment firsthand. Therefore, propaganda about American brutality couldn't be contradicted by actual experience. By 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, Japanese military leadership understood that increasing numbers of soldiers would face capture. The propaganda intensified rather than moderated. Leaflets dropped on Japanese positions by American forces, offering surrender and promising humane treatment, were dismissed as psychological warfare designed to trick Japanese soldiers into dishonorable captivity. Japanese officers told troops that American surrender leaflets were traps. If you surrendered based on American promises, you would be tortured and killed, and your family would be informed you died dishonorably. Better to die fighting than to trust enemy promises. The disconnect between propaganda and reality was absolute. While Japanese soldiers were being taught that Americans executed wounded enemies, American military medical doctrine was establishing exactly the opposite principle. U.S. Army Medical Department Regulations, 1942. Medical personnel shall provide medical care to all wounded personnel regardless of nationality. Enemy wounded shall receive the same standard of care as friendly wounded, limited only by availability of resources. Medical personnel shall not discriminate in treatment based on nationality, and shall treat enemy wounded as patients requiring medical care, not as prisoners requiring punishment. Medical care for enemy wounded serves multiple purposes: humanitarian obligation under Geneva Conventions, demonstration of American values and respect for human life, intelligence value of healthy prisoners, encouragement of enemy forces to surrender rather than fight to death. Most importantly, medical personnel save lives because that is their professional duty, regardless of whose life requires saving. These regulations were backed by training that emphasized professional medical ethics over national loyalty. American combat medics were trained that their job was saving lives, all lives. The wounded enemy was a patient, not a target. Corpsman John Bradley, who would later serve at Iwo Jima, described his training. "They drilled into us, your job is to save lives. Doesn't matter if it's a Marine or a Japanese soldier. If they're wounded, they're your patient. You treat the most serious wounds first, regardless of whose body contains those wounds. You don't let someone die because they're the enemy. You're a medic, not an executioner." Some guys struggled with this concept. Why save the life of someone who was trying to kill your buddies? The instructors were blunt. Because we're Americans, and Americans don't murder wounded enemies. Because we follow Geneva Conventions even if the enemy doesn't. Because proving we're better than the enemy means acting better than the enemy. And because a dead enemy can't tell you where their unit's positions are, but a live, grateful enemy prisoner might. This created a profound philosophical divide between Japanese and American military medical cultures. Japanese military medical philosophy. Medical care prioritized by rank and unit loyalty. Wounded who could not return to combat were often left untreated. Enemy wounded were not considered deserving of medical care. Surrender of wounded was considered shameful. Suicide was preferable. Medical personnel were combat troops first, medics second. American military medical philosophy. Medical care prioritized by severity of wounds, not rank or nationality. All wounded received treatment regardless of return to combat prospects. Enemy wounded entitled to same care as friendly wounded. Preservation of life was primary goal regardless of tactical considerations. Medical personnel were non-combatants protected by Geneva Conventions. These incompatible philosophies would collide violently when American forces began capturing significant numbers of Japanese POWs in 1944-45. The Japanese soldiers who survived to become prisoners expected torture and death based on years of indoctrination. Instead, they encountered American medics determined to save their lives using the same standards applied to American casualties. The psychological impact would be devastating, not because American treatment was cruel, but because it was kind. Japanese POWs faced a cognitive crisis. Everything they had been taught about Americans was wrong, which meant everything they had been taught about honor, shame, and proper military conduct might also be wrong. This realization would prove more traumatic than physical wounds. The first major clash between Japanese death before dishonor culture and American life-saving medical practice occurred during the Battle of Saipan in June-July 1944. This battle would produce thousands of Japanese POWs, a number unprecedented in Pacific warfare, and create the first large-scale encounter between Japanese soldiers and American military medical care. June 15, 1944. American forces landed on Saipan against fierce Japanese resistance. The island garrison of 32,000 Japanese troops had been ordered to fight to the death, with no expectation of survival or surrender. Japanese commander Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito issued orders that reflected standard Japanese doctrine. Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death. However, in death there is life. We must utilize this opportunity to exalt true Japanese manhood. I will advance with those who remain to deliver another blow to the American devils, and leave my bones on Saipan as a bulwark of the Pacific. This was not metaphor, it was literal operational planning. The garrison expected to die. Individual soldiers were trained to expect death. Surrender was not contemplated because surrender was unthinkable. But the reality of combat against overwhelming American firepower produced a situation. Japanese indoctrination hadn't prepared soldiers for being wounded so severely they couldn't fight, couldn't commit suicide, but also didn't immediately die. Private First Class Takeshi Nakamura was wounded on June 17th when American artillery shattered his defensive position. Shrapnel tore through his chest and abdomen. He lost consciousness, expecting to die. When he woke to find himself in American custody, his first thought wasn't gratitude for survival, it was shame for having failed to die honorably. His second thought was terror. Based on everything he'd been taught, the Americans would now torture him before eventually killing him. He waited for the torture to begin. Instead, American medics immediately triaged his wounds, classified him as urgent surgical, and evacuated him to a field hospital where a surgical team spent 4 hours repairing internal damage and stopping hemorrhaging. They gave him blood plasma, a precious resource in limited supply to replace blood loss. They administered morphine for pain. They placed him in a recovery ward with other seriously wounded patients, some American, some Japanese. When Nakamura regained consciousness and realized he was in an American medical facility, his terror intensified. But hour after hour, no torture came. Instead, American medics checked his vital signs, changed his bandages, gave him water and food, administered antibiotics to prevent infection. They treated him like a patient. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Nakamura's post-war testimony describes his psychological state. I couldn't understand what was happening. I expected torture. Instead, they gave me medical care. I expected cruelty. Instead, they treated me gently. I expected death. Instead, they fought hard to keep me alive. The most confusing moment came the second day after my surgery. My bandages needed changing. The American medic, very young, couldn't have been more than 20 years old, removed my old bandages carefully, trying not to cause pain. When he saw the surgical incision, he smiled and said something in English I didn't understand. Then he cleaned the wound, applied fresh bandages, and patted my shoulder in a friendly way. I realized he was pleased the surgery was successful. He was happy I was recovering. This American medic, whose friends I had been trying to kill days earlier, was genuinely glad I wasn't dying. This destroyed everything I believed. If Americans were cruel beasts who tortured prisoners, why was this medic treating me kindly? If Americans had no honor, why were they wasting precious medical supplies on enemy prisoner? If capture meant death, why were they fighting so hard to keep me alive? I had been prepared for torture. I had no preparation for mercy. The torture would have confirmed what I was taught. The mercy shattered it. This pattern repeated thousands of times across Saipan as American forces captured unprecedented numbers of Japanese POWs. The standard Japanese defensive tactic, fight to the death, commit suicide rather than surrender, was breaking down under overwhelming American firepower. Increasing numbers of Japanese soldiers were being wounded too severely to commit suicide, but not severely enough to die immediately. These men became prisoners, not through voluntary surrender, but through involuntary incapacitation. And once in American custody, they encountered medical care that contradicted everything their training had taught them. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Robert DeGeus, serving with the 2nd Marine Division on Saipan, described treating Japanese wounded. The Japanese prisoners were terrified, not angry, not defiant, terrified. They expected us to kill them. Some begged to be executed rather than tortured. When we started treating their wounds instead, they literally couldn't process it. I treated one Japanese soldier with severe abdominal wounds. He kept trying to pull his bandages off, not in defiance, but because he wanted to bleed out and die. He preferred death to whatever he thought we would do to him. I had to restrain him to keep him from killing himself while I was trying to save his life. After a few days, when he realized we weren't going to torture him, his whole demeanor changed. He started cooperating with treatment. He let us feed him, he followed medical instructions, but his eyes showed complete confusion, like his entire understanding of the world had been shattered. Another Japanese POW, a sergeant who'd been badly burned, kept asking questions through our interpreter. "Why are you helping me? Why aren't you killing me? What are you going to do to me?" Sergeant, the interpreter, explained we would treat his wounds and keep him in POW camp until the war ended. The sergeant literally couldn't believe this. He insisted there must be some trick, some cruelty coming later. The concept of humane POW treatment was so foreign to him that he couldn't accept it even when experiencing it. The medical care Japanese POWs received was not merely adequate. It often exceeded what the Japanese military medical system provided to its own soldiers. American mobile surgical hospitals had capabilities that Japanese field hospitals couldn't match. Blood plasma for transfusions, adequate anesthesia, antibiotics to prevent infection, professional surgical teams with modern equipment. Japanese wounded who had resigned themselves to dying from wounds that Japanese military medicine couldn't treat discovered that American military medicine could save them. This created additional psychological trauma. The enemy provided better medical care than their own military had. Private Yoshio Nakano, captured on Saipan with multiple gunshot wounds, later testified, "I had been wounded before during fighting on New Guinea. Japanese medical treatment was minimal. Bandages if available, morphine only for officers, no real surgery. I watched men die from wounds that should have been treatable because we lacked medical supplies and trained surgeons. This was normal. We accepted it. When Americans captured me on Saipan, I had 2 bullet wounds in my legs and 1 in my shoulder. I expected to die slowly from infection or blood loss. Instead, American surgeons removed the bullets, cleaned and stitched the wounds, gave me antibiotics and pain medication, and monitored my recovery carefully. Within 2 weeks, I was walking with crutches. Within a month, my wounds had healed cleanly with no infection. American military medicine had saved my life from wounds that would have killed me in Japanese military custody, not because Americans cared more about me than Japanese commanders cared about their own troops, but because Americans had better medicine and actually used it on prisoners. This was more shameful than being captured. I survived because the enemy valued my life more than my own military valued Japanese soldiers' lives. The contrast became even more stark when Japanese POWs witnessed American medics treating American casualties. Japanese POWs expected that Americans would prioritize their own wounded over enemy wounded. This would be logical and consistent with Japanese military practice. Instead, they observed American medics triaging casualties based purely on medical need, not nationality. American medics treated the most severely wounded first, regardless of whether that patient was American or Japanese. A critically wounded Japanese soldier received treatment before a lightly wounded American soldier. This application of pure medical ethics without nationalist bias was incomprehensible to Japanese POWs who had been taught that loyalty to nation superseded all other considerations. Corporal Akira Matsumoto, captured on Saipan and held in POW hospital, witnessed this triage system. An American Marine and a Japanese soldier were brought into hospital at the same time. Both had serious wounds. The American had leg wounds. Painful but not life-threatening. The Japanese soldier had chest wound, life-threatening if not treated immediately. I expected American medics would treat their own soldier first. This would be natural and proper. Instead, they took Japanese soldier to surgery immediately while American Marine waited. The American Marine even encouraged this. He told medics to take care of the Japanese soldier first because his wounds were worse. I couldn't understand this. Why would Americans prioritize enemy over their own troops? The interpreter explained American military medical ethics. Treat worst wounds first, regardless of nationality. Save the lives that are most in danger. Nationality is secondary to medical need. This was completely alien to Japanese military culture. We prioritized by rank, by unit loyalty, by tactical value. A private with critical wounds might be left to die, while an officer with minor wounds received immediate care. Americans prioritized by medical need alone. The most severely wounded received treatment first, even if that meant enemy prisoners received care before American troops. This wasn't cruelty toward their own soldiers. It was professionalism. American medics followed medical ethics that transcended national loyalty. This concept didn't exist in Japanese military medicine. We understood loyalty to emperor, loyalty to unit, loyalty to commanders. We didn't understand loyalty to professional medical ethics that applied to enemy prisoners equally. The psychological impact intensified when Japanese POWs received not just emergency care but ongoing treatment and rehabilitation. American medical personnel didn't save Japanese lives, then abandon them. They provided continuing care until prisoners fully recovered. This included surgeries to repair old wounds, dental care, treatment for diseases like malaria and dysentery, even prosthetics for amputees. Japanese POWs who had lost limbs in combat received artificial limbs made by American prosthetists, something the Japanese military rarely provided even to its own wounded. The cumulative effect was a complete psychological breakdown of Japanese indoctrination. Everything they had been taught about Americans, that they were cruel, that they tortured prisoners, that capture meant death, was proven absolutely false through direct personal experience. More traumatic, Japanese POWs realized their own military had lied to them. Not exaggerated, not misunderstood, deliberately lied. And that lie had caused thousands of Japanese soldiers to die unnecessarily, fighting to the death or committing suicide rather than surrender to an enemy who would have saved their lives. Private Nakamura, recovering from his chest wound, described the moment of realization. 10 days after my surgery, an American doctor examined my incision. He was pleased with healing, no infection, good recovery. Through the interpreter, he told me I would survive and eventually be repatriated to Japan after the war. That's when it hit me. I would survive. I would return to Japan. The Americans who I'd been taught would torture and kill me were instead ensuring I would survive to go home. How many Japanese soldiers died unnecessarily because we believed the lies? How many committed suicide to avoid capture when capture would have meant medical care and survival? How many fought to death when surrender would have meant living to see their families again? We were taught Americans were monsters. The real monsters were the officers who lied to us, sending us to unnecessary deaths to serve propaganda about honor and shame. The Americans showed more concern for Japanese prisoners than Japanese commanders showed for Japanese soldiers. This realization was more painful than my physical wounds. I survived because I was captured. Thousands died because they believed lies and refused capture. I lived because the enemy saved me. They died because our own military condemned them. By the end of the Battle of Saipan in July 1944, American forces had captured approximately 1,780 Japanese military prisoners, an unprecedented number in Pacific warfare. Of these, over 900 had been wounded when captured. American medical personnel had saved hundreds of lives that would otherwise have been lost to wounds, infection, or deliberate suicide. These survivors carried with them a profound psychological burden. They had been proven wrong about everything. The enemy, who was supposed to be subhuman beasts, had shown humanity. The capture that was supposed to bring torture and death had brought medical care and survival. The Americans they had been taught to despise had saved their lives. This cognitive dissonance would intensify in the months ahead as Japanese POWs experienced not just medical care but comprehensive humane treatment that further contradicted everything they had been taught. The medical care Japanese POWs received was only the beginning of their psychological transformation. As they recovered from wounds and moved from field hospitals to POW camps, they encountered a comprehensive system of humane treatment that systematically contradicted every element of Japanese propaganda about American brutality. POW Camp 6, Oahu, Hawaii, September 1944. This facility housed approximately 2,500 Japanese POWs, many of them wounded survivors from Saipan who had received American medical care. The camp represented the collision between Japanese expectations of POW treatment and American reality. Private Nakamura, now recovered from his chest wound, described his arrival at the camp. "We expected prison camp to be hell. Starvation rations, brutal guards, forced labor, constant punishment. This was what we'd been taught about American POW camps. Instead, we found barracks with beds, mess halls serving adequate food, medical clinic with Japanese-speaking doctor, even recreational facilities. The daily ration was better than what I'd eaten as Japanese soldier in the field. Not luxury food, but adequate calories, variety, clean water. We were given clothing, blankets, basic supplies. The guards were professional, but not cruel. They enforced rules, but didn't beat prisoners for minor infractions. Most shocking, We were allowed to write letters home. American authorities would forward letters to Japan through neutral Switzerland. We could tell our families we were alive. This was incomprehensible. Why would Americans allow this? How did this serve their war effort? The interpreter explained, Geneva Conventions required it. Americans followed these rules even when Japanese forces didn't. This was the first time I heard of Geneva Conventions. Japanese military had never mentioned these rules because Japan had never ratified them. We had been fighting a war with one set of rules while America fought with completely different rules. Rules that protected even enemy prisoners. The transformation from terrified prisoners expecting death to confused prisoners experiencing humane treatment followed a consistent pattern documented by American camp administrators. Stage 1, terror. Days 1 to 3. Newly arrived POWs expected immediate execution or torture. Some refused to eat believing food was poisoned. Some refused medical care believing it was a prelude to experimentation. Most cooperated out of fear of punishment rather than understanding of humane treatment. Stage 2, confusion, days 4 to 14. As days passed without torture or execution, POWs became confused. They couldn't reconcile their experience with their indoctrination. Many believed the humane treatment was temporary, that cruelty would begin once Americans no longer needed cooperation. Some developed elaborate theories about why Americans were delaying inevitable torture. Stage 3, cognitive dissonance, weeks 3 to 8. Continued humane treatment created psychological crisis. POWs were forced to choose. Either Americans were somehow uniquely kind to them, specifically implausible, or everything they'd been taught about Americans was wrong, psychologically devastating. Most prisoners struggled with this cognitive dissonance for weeks. Stage 4. Acceptance, weeks 9+. Eventually, most POWs accepted that American humane treatment was genuine, systematic policy rather than temporary kindness. This acceptance required rebuilding their entire worldview. Everything they'd believed about honor, shame, enemies, and warfare had to be reconsidered. Captain Theodore Hoshino, Japanese-American interpreter serving at POW Camp 6, described the transformation. The newly arrived prisoners were terrified. They'd been taught we would kill them. When we didn't, they were confused. When we continued treating them well week after week, they started questioning everything they'd been taught. I conducted interviews with prisoners to assess their attitude and help them adjust. The conversations were remarkably similar. Prisoners would ask, "Why aren't you torturing us?" I'd explain Geneva Conventions and American values. They'd respond with skepticism, "This must be trick." After weeks of humane treatment, the skepticism would break down and they'd ask different question. Why did our officers lie to us? That was the transformation moment when they stopped blaming Americans for supposed future cruelty and started blaming Japanese commanders for past lies. Once they reached that realization, their entire worldview shifted. Many prisoners experienced genuine psychological trauma, not from American mistreatment, but from recognizing their own military had lied to them. We had Japanese prisoners who became depressed, who couldn't sleep, who showed symptoms of what we'd now call PTSD, not from combat, but from the realization that they had been deceived and their comrades had died because of those deceptions. The medical care continued in POW camps. Camp 6 had a fully equipped medical clinic staffed by American doctors and Japanese POW medical personnel working under American supervision. Prisoners received ongoing treatment for chronic conditions, follow-up surgeries for inadequately healed wounds, dental care, even psychological counseling for those struggling with their circumstances. This continuing medical attention reinforced the psychological transformation. It wasn't just that Americans had saved Japanese lives during initial capture. Americans continued caring about Japanese health and well-being weeks and months after capture. When there was no tactical advantage to such care, Private Yoshio Nakano, whose legs had been treated at Saipan, received follow-up care at Camp 6. My leg wounds healed but left me with limp. Muscles and nerves had been damaged. American doctor referred me to physical therapist who worked with me 3 times per week teaching exercises to rebuild leg strength. After 2 months, I could walk normally again. This physical therapy served no American military purpose. I was already captured. I couldn't fight. Healing my leg completely, rather than just adequately, gained Americans nothing tactically. They did it because professional medical care meant treating patients until they recovered fully, even if patients were enemy prisoners. I thought about Japanese wounded I'd seen left to die because military doctors decided they wouldn't return to combat. I thought about Japanese soldiers with treatable wounds who died because resources were limited and they were low priority. I thought about how Japanese military viewed wounded soldiers as burdens rather than people deserving care. Americans treated me better as enemy prisoner than Japanese military treated its own soldiers. This comparison made me ashamed, not ashamed of being prisoner, but ashamed of military culture that valued soldiers only for combat utility rather than as humans deserving care. The psychological transformation extended beyond individual prisoners to create cultural questioning among POW populations. In camps where many prisoners were held together, they discussed their experiences and collectively processed the disconnect between indoctrination and reality. These discussions, monitored by Japanese-speaking American intelligence officers, revealed the depth of psychological change. Recorded conversation, POW Camp 6, November 1944. Prisoner A. My brother died on Attu. Committed suicide with grenade rather than be captured. He believed capture meant torture. Now I know Americans would have treated his wounds and he would still be alive. He died for a lie. Prisoner B. We all believe the lies. I saw men commit suicide rather than surrender. I tried to kill myself after being wounded but was too weak. Americans saved me despite my attempts to die. Now those dead comrades seem like victims of propaganda rather than heroes. Prisoner C. But we were taught suicide was honorable, surrender was shameful. If that teaching was wrong, what else was wrong? Our entire understanding of honor and shame might be backward. Prisoner A. Maybe honor isn't dying for empty principles. Maybe honor is recognizing truth when you see it, even if truth contradicts what you were taught. These conversations represented fundamental questioning of Japanese military culture and Bushido philosophy. POWs were collectively rebuilding their moral framework based on observed reality rather than received indoctrination. American camp administrators recognized this transformation and, starting in late 1944, implemented formal re-education programs. These weren't crude propaganda. They were educational curricula teaching about democratic governance, Geneva Conventions, international law, and American values. The programs were voluntary, but participation rates exceeded 80% among long-term prisoners. POWs who had initially expected torture were now voluntarily attending classes taught by Americans about American values. The transformation was remarkable. Corporal Matsumoto attended these classes at Camp 6. The classes taught us about Geneva Conventions, international agreements about treatment of POWs, wounded, civilians. We learned these rules existed before the war, that Japan had signed but never ratified them, that America followed them even when Japan didn't. We learned about American democratic system, elections, individual rights, civilian control of military. This contrasted sharply with Japanese system, where military-controlled government and individual rights were subordinate to state. Most importantly, we learned why Americans treated us humanely. Not because they were soft or weak, because they believed certain principles transcended national loyalty. Medical ethics said save wounded regardless of nationality. Geneva Conventions said treat POWs humanely regardless of enemy behavior. American values said individual humans had inherent worth beyond their military utility. These ideas were revolutionary to us. We'd been taught that individual life meant nothing compared to collective glory, that mercy was weakness, that enemy deserved no consideration. Americans demonstrated opposite principles could coexist with military strength, that you could fight hard against enemies while still treating captured enemies humanely. The classes didn't make us love America. Many prisoners remained loyal to Japan despite everything. But they made us question the military culture that had lied to us and sent thousands to unnecessary deaths. By 1945, as the war approached its end, American POW camps housed over 5,400 Japanese prisoners. A tiny fraction of Japanese forces engaged, but a historically unprecedented number given Japanese resistance to surrender. The medical care and humane treatment these prisoners received created a population of Japanese who had directly experienced contradiction of Japanese propaganda. Their testimonies, recorded by American intelligence and later used in psychological warfare, had profound impact on remaining Japanese forces. When Japanese soldiers heard from fellow Japanese that Americans treated prisoners humanely, it undermined propaganda more effectively than any American claims could. Leaflets dropped on Japanese positions in 1945 included quotes from Japanese POWs describing their treatment. "I am Private Takeshi Nakamura, formerly of the 43rd Division. I was wounded on Saipan and expected to die. American medics saved my life with surgery and medicine. I am now in POW camp in Hawaii, well fed and treated according to international law. I will survive to return to Japan after the war. The military lied to us about American treatment of prisoners. Surrender is not death, it is survival. Don't die for lies." These testimonials from fellow Japanese soldiers were far more effective than American propaganda could ever be. Japanese troops might dismiss American claims as enemy lies, but they couldn't easily dismiss detailed testimonies from Japanese soldiers who had experienced American POW system. The impact became measurable. Japanese surrender rates, while still low by Western standards, increased significantly in final year of war. On Okinawa in 1945, over 7,400 Japanese military personnel surrendered, more than an entire previous Pacific campaign combined. Many cited belief that American treatment of POWs was humane, based on testimonials from previous prisoners. The transformation of Japanese POWs from terrified prisoners expecting death to witnesses testifying to humane treatment represented one of World War II's most profound psychological operations, not through crude propaganda but through simple, consistent application of humane principles that contradicted enemy indoctrination through lived experience. The end of the war in August 1945 brought final chapter in the story of Japanese POWs transformed by American medical care and humane treatment. As repatriation began, prisoners faced returning to a Japan that had been taught the same propaganda about American brutality and would struggle to accept that these returning soldiers had survived honorable American captivity. The psychological burden carried by repatriated POWs was immense. They had survived when taught they should have died. They had been treated humanely when taught they would be tortured. They had experienced mercy that shattered their understanding of honor, shame, and military virtue. Takeshi Nakamura, the soldier whose story opened this account, returned to Japan in October 1945. His homecoming illustrated the challenges former POWs faced. "My family was shocked I survived. They'd received notification I was killed in action. Standard Japanese military practice when soldiers were captured. They'd mourned me for over a year. When I appeared alive, their first emotion was joy. Their second was confusion about how I survived. When I explained I'd been captured and treated by Americans, the joy disappeared. My father was ashamed I'd surrendered. My mother wept, not from happiness but from shame. Neighbors avoided our family. We were tainted by my dishonor. I tried to explain. I didn't surrender voluntarily. I was unconscious from wounds. Americans saved my life with surgery Japanese military medicine couldn't provide. Americans treated me humanely according to international law Japan had ignored. No one wanted to hear this. Acknowledging Americans treated prisoners well meant acknowledging Japanese military had lied for years. Acknowledging I survived through American mercy meant questioning Japanese concepts of honor and shame. Easier to call me dishonorable than to question entire moral framework of Japanese military culture. Many former POWs experienced this. We survived but came home to families and society that considered our survival shameful. We knew truth about American treatment, but society preferred believing propaganda. We had been transformed by our experience, but Japan hadn't changed yet. The Japanese government under occupation struggled with how to address returning POWs. Official policy shifted from treating former prisoners as shameful to acknowledging their survival, but societal attitudes changed more slowly. Former POWs often found themselves marginalized, unable to discuss their experiences openly without facing social stigma. The transformation they had experienced from believing propaganda about American brutality to understanding Americans had saved their lives remained private knowledge they couldn't share publicly without social consequences. However, a minority of former POWs chose to speak publicly about their experiences, particularly after Japan regained sovereignty in 1952. These testimonies, initially controversial, gradually contributed to post-war Japanese understanding of wartime propaganda and the cost of Bushido death before dishonor culture. Corporal Akira Matsumoto became one of the most vocal former POWs, writing memoirs and speaking at schools about his experiences. "I survived because Americans valued human life more than my own military did. This truth was shameful to admit, not because I was captured, but because it revealed how Japanese military culture treated Japanese soldiers as expendable. Americans performed surgery on me when wounded. Americans provided ongoing medical care. Americans fed me adequately. Americans treated me according to international law. Americans prepared me for post-war return to Japan. Japanese military had done none of these things for its own soldiers when it had the chance. Japanese commanders sent soldiers to die without adequate supplies, without medical care, without any plan for survival. Then they told us this was honorable. The real dishonor wasn't surrender. It was the military system that valued soldiers only as weapons to be expended. Americans showed more respect for Japanese prisoners than Japanese commanders showed for Japanese soldiers. I speak about this not to praise America or condemn Japan, but to ensure younger generations understand the cost of believing propaganda that despises mercy and glorifies meaningless death. Medical personnel who had treated Japanese POWs reflected on their experiences with mixture of professional satisfaction and recognition of the cultural trauma they'd unintentionally caused. Dr. James Vetter, who had performed surgery on dozens of Japanese wounded at Saipan, "We saved their lives because that's what we do. We're doctors. We didn't think about psychological implications of contradicting their indoctrination. We just treated wounds and tried to keep patients alive." Years later, I learned that many Japanese POWs experienced psychological trauma from our humane treatment, not because we were cruel, but because we weren't. Their entire worldview was based on expectation of American brutality. When they experienced American mercy instead, it shattered their understanding of everything. Some might say we should have been less kind to avoid this trauma. I reject that completely. We treated Japanese wounded the same way we treated American wounded because that's professional medical ethics. If that kindness traumatized them by contradicting their propaganda, the trauma came from the propaganda, not from our treatment. I'm proud we saved Japanese lives. I'm proud we upheld medical ethics even when the enemy didn't. If that made their propaganda collapse and forced them to question what they'd been taught, that's a positive outcome, even if the personal process was painful. The broader impact of Japanese POW experiences extended beyond individual testimonies. Post-war Japanese society's engagement with wartime propaganda and military culture was shaped partly by recognition that Japanese soldiers had been lied to about American POW treatment. This recognition contributed to post-war Japanese pacifism and skepticism toward military propaganda. If the military had lied about American treatment of POWs, a lie proven false by thousands of survivors, what else had the military lied about? By the 1960s to 70s, as Japan's post-war generation came of age, former POW testimonies became important historical sources for understanding wartime propaganda's impact. Academic studies examined how Japanese military indoctrination had created death before dishonor culture that cost thousands of lives unnecessarily. Professor Hiroshi Tanaka, studying Japanese military culture, wrote in 1973, "The testimony of Japanese POWs who experienced American medical care reveals the profound cost of Bushido propaganda. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died fighting to the death or committing suicide based on false belief that capture meant torture and execution. These deaths weren't heroic sacrifices for Japan, they were meaningless deaths caused by propaganda. The soldiers who survived to become POWs discovered that surrender meant medical care, adequate food, and eventual repatriation. Their survival proved that death before dishonor doctrine was propaganda serving military goals, not eternal truth serving Japanese interests." Most tragic, many Japanese soldiers who died refusing surrender would have survived to return to families if they had known the truth about American POW treatment. They died for lies told by commanders who cared more about propaganda value of soldiers dying honorably than about soldiers' actual lives. In 1985, at a U.S.-Japan military history conference in Tokyo, former Japanese POWs met with American veterans who had been involved in their capture and treatment. The exchange provided emotional closure to stories that had begun 40-plus years earlier. Takeshi Nakamura, by then 69 years old, met Robert Degius, the corpsman who had treated his wounds at Saipan. Nakamura, you saved my life. I was dying from chest wound. You performed first aid, evacuated me to surgery, cared for me during recovery. For 40 years, I've wanted to thank you. Degius, I was doing my job. You were wounded. I was a medic. Pretty straightforward. Nakamura, no, not straightforward. You were enemy medic. I was enemy soldier who had been trying to kill Americans. You had every reason to let me die. Instead, you fought to save me. This wasn't just doing job. This was demonstrating values your culture believed in. Degius, we were taught to treat wounded regardless of nationality. Geneva Conventions and medical ethics required it. But honestly, I didn't think much about ethics at the time. You were a patient who needed help, so I helped. The uniform didn't matter. Nakamura, that's exactly what made it powerful. You treated me as human needing help, not as enemy deserving punishment. This simple act of medical professionalism destroyed years of propaganda I'd believed. Degius, did that cause you problems? I've read that Japanese POWs faced stigma when they returned home. Nakamura, yes, significant problems for years, but I survived. Many Japanese soldiers died believing lies about American brutality. They fought to death or committed suicide rather than surrender to enemy they thought would torture them. You and medics like you proved those lies wrong, but proved it too late for thousands who died unnecessarily. Degius, that's the hardest part for me. I saved maybe 100 Japanese lives. But I think about the thousands who died refusing surrender because they didn't know we would treat them humanely. If somehow we could have gotten that message to them. Nakamura, the message got out eventually. Through testimonies from prisoners like me. By 1945, Japanese surrender rates increased because soldiers learned from previous prisoners that Americans treated POWs humanely. Your medical care saved my life directly and saved other lives indirectly by proving propaganda was false. This is why I thank you, not just for saving me, but for upholding principles that eventually saved others. The final statistics of Japanese POW experience in American custody demonstrate the systematic application of humane treatment principles, despite extreme cultural barriers. Japanese POW statistics World War II. Total Japanese military prisoners held by U.S. forces, 5,400 plus. By war's end, dramatically low due to death before dishonor culture. Japanese POWs who received medical treatment for wounds, approximately 3,800, 70% plus. Mortality rate of Japanese POWs in U.S. custody, 3 to 4%, primarily from wounds sustained before capture that were too severe to treat. Comparative mortality rate of Allied POWs in Japanese custody, 27%, due to malnutrition, disease, mistreatment, and deliberate killing. Medical care statistics. Surgeries performed on Japanese POWs, 2,100 plus major procedures. Blood plasma units provided to Japanese wounded, 8,500 plus units, precious resource in wartime. Japanese POW amputees fitted with prosthetics, 180 plus. Man-hours of physical therapy provided, 45,000 plus hours. Cost of medical care for Japanese POWs. Equivalent to medical care for American casualties. No discrimination in resource allocation. Post-war impact. Japanese POWs repatriated 1945 to 46. 5,200 plus returned to Japan alive. Former POWs who reported humane treatment, 95% plus in post-war surveys. Former POWs who acknowledged propaganda about American brutality was false, 98% plus. Psychological trauma reported by former POWs, 60% plus reported difficulty reconciling humane treatment with expectation of cruelty. These numbers tell a remarkable story. American forces treated enemy combatants who had been taught to despise them with professional medical care that contradicted everything those enemies believed, creating psychological transformation more powerful than any propaganda campaign could achieve. In the Japanese Peace Memorial Museum in Hiroshima, an exhibit on POW experiences includes testimony from former prisoners. The display features medical records, photographs, and first-person accounts that document the collision between Japanese death culture indoctrination and American life-saving medical practice. The central placard reads, Japanese soldiers were taught that capture by Americans meant torture and death. This propaganda caused thousands to fight to death or commit suicide rather than surrender. Those who survived to become prisoners discovered that American military medical personnel treated enemy wounded with the same professional care given to American casualties. This humane treatment, required by Geneva Conventions and American military medical ethics, contradicted Japanese propaganda so completely that many prisoners experienced psychological trauma, not from American cruelty, but from recognition that everything they had been taught was false. The American medics who saved Japanese lives demonstrated that professional medical ethics transcend national loyalty, that wounded enemies deserve care rather than execution, and that humane treatment of prisoners serves moral principles beyond tactical advantage. Many Japanese soldiers died unnecessarily because they believed propaganda about American brutality. Those who survived as POWs discovered the truth that Americans valued human life enough to save enemy lives, even when those enemies had been taught to kill Americans without mercy. The lesson: propaganda that glorifies death and despises mercy costs lives needlessly. The American medics who treated Japanese wounded upheld principles that Japanese propaganda claimed didn't exist, and in doing so, proved that mercy is not weakness but strength. Below this is a quote from Takeshi Nakamura, recorded in 1989. "I was taught that Americans were beasts who would torture prisoners. I was taught that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. I was taught that dying for the emperor was the highest virtue. Then American medics saved my life. They performed surgery to repair my wounds. They gave me blood transfusions and antibiotics. They treated me with professional care and human kindness. This shattered everything I believed. Not because Americans were cruel, because they were kind. Not because they confirmed propaganda, because they contradicted it completely. I lived because the enemy valued my life more than my own commanders did. I survived because Americans followed Geneva Conventions my own military ignored. I returned to Japan because enemy medics fought as hard to save my life as they fought to defeat my army. For 45 years, I have lived with this knowledge. Mercy is not weakness, but the truest strength. Compassion for enemies demonstrates greater courage than hatred. And the Americans who saved my life possessed more honor than the commanders who sent me to die for lies. I was stunned when American medics saved my life instead of ending it. That stunning moment transformed my understanding of honor, humanity, and what it means to truly be civilized. The American medics were not monsters, they were healers. My own military culture was the monster, and I was too indoctrinated to see it until Americans showed me through their mercy. The story of Japanese POWs stunned by American medical care represents one of World War II's most profound cultural confrontations, not a clash of armies, but a collision between philosophies of life and death, between propaganda and reality, between death before dishonor culture and humanitarian medical ethics. American military medics, following Geneva Conventions and professional medical ethics, saved thousands of enemy lives because that was their job, to save lives regardless of whose lives needed saving. They didn't do it for propaganda value or tactical advantage. They did it because professional medical practice meant treating patients based on medical need, not based on national loyalty or patients' previous behavior. This simple application of medical ethics had a revolutionary impact on Japanese prisoners who expected execution but received medical care. It shattered propaganda, transformed worldviews, and proved that humane principles were not weakness but strength to treat enemies humanely even when enemies had been taught to despise everything you represented. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered expecting death discovered instead that American medics would fight just as hard to save their lives as they had fought to defeat their army. This discovery, stunning, transformative, and lasting, would shape their understanding of humanity for the rest of their lives. They were taught mercy was weakness. They learned instead that mercy was the truest form of strength. Strength to uphold principles even when it was difficult, even when recipients didn't deserve help. Even when helping the enemy contradicted all tactical logic. The American medics who saved Japanese lives demonstrated what civilization actually means, not crushing enemies without mercy, but treating even enemies with humanity because humanity is not conditional on reciprocity. The Japanese POWs were stunned. And in that stunning recognition, they discovered truths about honor, mercy, and human dignity that their own military culture had taught them to despise. Truths preserved in the simple red cross on a white armband, worn by medics who saved lives because that's what medics do, regardless of whose life needs saving.